So good afternoon again. Um, just Today we've got Tim and myself looking at the issues of surrounding food, and particularly the upcoming issues surrounding the potential change of the law to stop agricultural ground being hung on to be converted into property. So Tim, are you there?
I am, yes.
So what can you tell us about that, Tim?
It was a campaign looking at affordable housing in rural areas. What they were saying is the reason property prices are so high is because people with spare land in the countryside tend to want to hang on to it in order to get the big housing developments, which of course are the ones that nobody really wants locally. So what they were talking about is whether they could get a change in the planning laws, which would effectively rule out being able to hold onto land in that way.
So, but presumably, if you own a piece of ground and you're farming it at present, even though it could potentially be built on, you're not really going to let that go unless you have to, because it's better off for you to farm it unless you're going to get the big payout.
Well, I suppose the problem they're trying to address is getting some land, usually on a small scale, to allow affordable housing. But the spin-off of it would be that where you've got land that's just lying idle, in the hope that you're going to get sort of planning permission for a big development, that if that's taken off the table, then farming it might become viable.
I see. So you're saying that you think that people are hanging on to it and not farming it in the meantime.
Well, I mean, that's true in some cases. Clearly it's going to vary in different parts of the country and different farms. I mean, it isn't probably an answer to the food crisis as a whole. But I'm just interested that we spoke about that last week, and then today there's a campaign in the news calling for it.
Yes, and we also spoke about the impacts of our choices of what we eat and what's happening in the supermarkets with their decisions to not really take on board the fact that we need to be careful about what we eat.
Yes, I mean, one of the interesting things to watch now is the sort of pre-Christmas sales, which we won't notice necessarily from our own direct experience, because supermarkets will be horrible in the run-up to Christmas anyway. But it's worth keeping an eye on the news for when the companies report their sales, because it can look busy when it actually isn't. And I think a lot of the supermarkets rely on this period now in the run-up to Christmas to make a lot of their money back. Because economically, the supermarkets could be in trouble if we get a year that's even worse than last year.
So you're saying that the fact that they run a lot of what they might call loss leaders, are they relying on the pre-Christmas rush and the fact that we spend more, and usually far more than we need to, in fact, to make up the difference?
Yes, I mean, it tends to be, they will build into their sort of projections for sales for the year that they'll have a lot of sales from now until Christmas. This whole Black Friday thing that they've brought in recent years is part of that, sort of getting everybody spending this time of year. As I say, it can look busy, but then when you look at what they're actually selling and how much profit they make from it, in the last couple of years, it's been quite a way down.
Yes, we spoke last week about the fact that really it looks as though some of those supermarkets are going to struggle to survive at all, despite the fact that they look busy from the outside and the fact that many of us use them. But actually there's such a fight between them that the profitability is not so great between them.
Yes, I mean, at the moment it's great for us because they're having to keep their prices low to keep getting us to go and shop there. When it gets nasty for us is when one or more of them goes bust, because suddenly they haven't got the competition and they don't need to keep the prices down as much. So at that point, we could well find ourselves paying a lot more for food.
You mean we'll start having to pay the real prices for it then?
Well, probably not even that in truth, because I mean their purchasing power does keep prices low. In the longer term, if you actually started to pay what food actually really costs to produce, we'd be spending a lot more as a proportion of our income.
Yes, and that's something I've thought quite frequently myself, and there was a big campaign, wasn't there, by the dairy farmers a while back to say that they weren't getting as much for their milk directly. A lot of the money that we were paying was going into the manufacturer stroke supermarket profits, where the actual farmer wasn't really getting as much money for his milk than it was costing him to produce.
Yeah, I mean the problem is really that we as end consumers are so disconnected from that. So if you like, our interaction is with the supermarkets. So we've just got used to the idea of having cheap food. So most of us have organised our sort of household budgets assuming that food will be cheap. The problem longer term is if the price of food goes up, it's not something you can avoid paying for.
Not really. It's not something we can cut out very easily. We might be able to cut out the extras, the things that we perhaps, shouldn't perhaps be eating anyway, the sweeties and the chocolates, but we still need our staple meal to keep going.
Yeah, I mean there's some evidence that we've already as a nation been doing that. So if you went back before the 2008 financial crisis, we threw away an awful lot of food. Apparently we're now throwing away just a third of what we used to throw away then, which is still too much. But actually the amount of waste that we're now generating from food is a lot less than it was. That to me is evidence of people cutting back on what they spend on food.
It would appear so, because much as I might like to think that the campaigns are making a difference and that we shouldn't be wasting, that it would be lovely to think that people really were doing it for the benefits of the planet, but I can't help thinking it's much more likely that that they're trying to cut down the budget.
Yeah, I mean, I think expense drives all of this. It's the same with your household energy bill. It's going to be the same with fuel for driving. That we will end up being squeezed more and more into only spending on essentials. The problem with that for something like the supermarkets is that their profit margins depend on, if you like, all of those things that are bad for us. So if you used to buy chocolate or biscuits or some extra bottles of wine, and that becomes what you cut out, then that across the entire of the economy is enough to cripple a supermarket.
Yes.
So it becomes this sort of downward spiral.
Yes, because those are the things that they keep the prices down on, that the essentials, so to speak, the essential shopping basket, the milk, the bread, the basic potatoes, they don't tend to put any real markup on those particular products.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of the things, if you look at your Facebook feed where you get all the videos about cats and all the other fairly trivial stuff, and I've heard people say, well, if only we used the internet for serious things. What people don't realise is that internet companies wouldn't be profitable if it wasn't for all of that frivolous stuff. It's the same with supermarkets, that it's our frivolous purchases that keep them profitable. The staples, basically, they're selling at a loss. And energy companies, it's a bit trickier with, but they are actually holding prices quite low. I mean, we can argue about whether they should be profitable at all, but at the end of the day, if we suddenly have big spikes in any of the prices of this kind of stuff, suddenly lots of us can't afford to do it.
I would say there's quite a few people who are only just surviving now, isn't there?
Yes, I mean, there's over 1 million visits to food banks last year, which is a measure of people who are no longer able to buy food. That should actually be worrying, not just in terms of those people, but the wider impact of that loss of turnover in the economy. So essentially they're relying on somebody else purchasing food and donating it. So even that, the more people start to cut back and the more people get into that system, the less profitable the people that are selling the food to us get. And my fear is that the supermarkets will clamp down even tighter on the farmers, so that the real risk is people just walk away. That farmers come up to retirement and there's nobody else to take the farm on. Then what?
I guess we're going to go back to a lot of wild land. Might be good for the wildlife, but in truth, I don't even think that's true. I think that in Britain we're very lucky that we have an agricultural system that is easier to keep productive, despite the fact that we're taking the food off it all of the time, and it's not, despite we put the seeds in, we'll grow the plant, but then we're taking the food away and eating it. We're not putting back a lot of organic materials because we simply don't have enough. But at least in Britain we do have quite significant livestock areas, so we have got a fair bit to put back on, and as we discussed last week, and also human waste goes back on the ground in Britain. And although some people might not like the idea of that, we actually really need a lot of it in order to keep land productive, and at least we're not getting deserts here just yet.
Yes, one of the other fairly crazy ideas that somebody had last week that was in the news was that they were going to take over grassland and use it for producing biomass to produce gas. So essentially they were going to use a sort of factory equivalent of a cow's stomach. So they digest fresh grass and turn it into a fertilizer at one end and methane gas at the other. As somebody pointed out, the problem with that, if you don't have the animals grazing the grass, is that you're not getting organic material back in. So essentially you're going to have to use chemicals to grow that grass. So essentially that is even worse for the soils than the kind of industrial agriculture that we see in other parts of the world.
Far worse, I would think, because not only that, but also if you don't take the grass, as in the vegetation, off the top, so that it keeps getting the sunlight down to the roots, the grass is going to die, the same as it's done in the desert areas around the world. I remember I was listening to a gentleman called Alan Savoy, I think his name is Savoy, is it? Yeah. Speaking about that once they took the animals away from certain areas, it much more quickly turned to desert, even though they thought that it was actually the animals that were causing the problem. In fact, it's not, because you've got to take the vegetation off, and you simply can't put more power on. We don't have it.
No, I mean, industrial agriculture relies a lot on artificial fertilization to replenish the soil, and the problem with that is it's a limited supply. Whereas animal grazing is circulating the nutrients.
Yes, it just seems to be almost a dead-end problem, really. We really do need, actually, far more people involved in what goes on the ground, and having a look at how food is really grown. Because we have all these sort of romantic ideas about what should happen, but the reality is it's dirty work. It really does demand a lot of physical effort, a lot of muck, a lot of mess for it to actually happen, and without it, it just won't grow.
No, I mean, as you say, we're lucky in the United Kingdom that actually our soils are still quite good. That said, some of the kind of rain we've been having here, as that becomes a more regular weather pattern, that washes a lot of nutrients away from the soil. It's kind of the wrong kind of rain. You get this huge downpour that causes lots of flooding, but then you'll get weeks of it just being drought. Whereas what you ideally want is that kind of soft ongoing rain that lasts for a couple of weeks, which none of us like, but the soil loves it.
Yes, yeah. I don't know. I don't mind a flutter of rain, but you can still garden in that. I don't mind getting a little bit damp, but that's true. If you get a real heavy downpour, you've got a real problem with soil washing away. Although if it's got a crop cover on, most of it will survive. But unfortunately, vast quantities of our cities are not covered with greenery anymore. They're concreted or road tarmac, so the runoff is huge, and it'll take what soil there is with it as well. It doesn't hold it there when it's washed in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting planning rules now that are trying to prevent hard stands and sort of trying to encourage people not to concrete over gardens. So yeah, we get terrible runoff in Cardiff. We have a sort of horseshoe of hills to the north and the west of Cardiff that you tend to get runoff down the hills. When you get into the housing estates that are built on the side of those hills, you can get a very quick runoff of water. So you get all sorts of problems with drains overflowing and kind of an awful lot of stuff, pollutants and stuff being washed out. And yes, I mean, certainly if you go into the South Wales valleys, then you've got an awful lot of nutrients being lost on the agricultural land.
Yes, it's quite. I was finding Alan Savory's information about how to stop the desertifying, whatever the word is, desertification. Get the word right. It's just when he showed the pictures from down at space, and just such huge, vast areas of land that is really becoming a problem. And so we kind of get a bit complacent, or maybe I do anyway, that Britain's a nice green and pleasant land, and we don't really have too much of the problem because we've got a lot of moisture here. And in fact, we Brits are always talking about the weather and the fact that it rains so much, but obviously if that rain lands on concrete ground or very hard desert soil, it just doesn't stay and it disappears. So we really need to think about how we're doing things around the world rather than just on our back doorstep. But still, anyway, we've got just a few minutes left before the end of the programme. So have you heard anything from the COP reports, Tim?
I think there's been a general sort of hostility towards the President-elect of the United States for some of his climate denial statements. And it is clear that he is going to face a lot of international pressure if he tries to renege on the deal. How that translates, who knows, and he may not be as bad as people are saying. We have to wait and see. But certainly some of the things that he's been saying are not particularly good for humanity. So again, it's what this the COP22 this year has been about far more is about the technicalities of how we address the problem. So if you like, we now have the agreement that we've got to cut our carbon emissions. We need to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, ideally 1.5 degrees centigrade. This one has been much more about, well, how are we going to do that? So I'm still waiting to see what comes out of that, because I'm not aware of any research at the moment that says we can. I think a lot of what's built into the IPCC projections are technologies that haven't yet been invented. So it's the hope that we can do things like carbon capture and storage, which is theoretically possible, but economically very difficult.
Yes, and that what the replanting of desert areas is as far as I can see, pretty high on the agenda, or no, not on the agenda. Needs to be high on the agenda if we're going to have any hope. The regrowing of those areas and the halving of our use of fossil fuels, if not more, at least in the West.
Yeah, well, our problem at the moment is there isn't a politician, or certainly not a mainstream one alive, that's prepared to sort of put to the country the kind of hardship we have to have in the short term to wean ourselves off carbon, or fossil fuels in the short term. So you have this constant kicking the can down the road of, well, the science people will come up with something sometime. I'm hopeful that they do, but I'm not that optimistic. I've yet to see a technology that isn't going to incur a lot of costs up front, and I'm not sure the politicians are prepared to make that leap.
That's the real problem, isn't it? I think we've got at least some of that technology now, but we're still not implementing it, are we? We still haven't got those great big wave machines in. We still aren't using the hydroelectric power that we could. We're still not using the wind and solar power that we could. And even though that might not completely dissolve the problem, you know, those things that we could do right now, we still are not doing, even though that would at least help to alleviate some of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested that you've got the new Chancellor is talking about his sort of interim budget report on Wednesday, where he's now talked about how they're going to borrow a load of money to invest in infrastructure, but he's going to spend it on the roads. So essentially that's going to add to the problem, not take away from it. You know, what we should be doing is shifting people away from the roads, not encouraging. You know, so if he'd have borrowed that money and said, okay, let's build some tidal barrages, let's build some wind turbines, then you're doing this, having the same economic impact of creating jobs, but you're actually longer term doing something that reverses the carbon that we're pumping into the atmosphere.
Yes, it's going to be a tough one to heal, that's for certain. And there's not enough people talking about it, that's also for certain. I think really we need an absolute uprising from the community for a real change to happen. However,
yeah, well, what I was going to say is I think people aren't making or realizing the link that, you know, the reason we have economic problems and the reason we have energy cost problems, the reason we're starting to see food problems, and the reason that governments aren't putting money into sort of climate change are actually linked problems. You know, it's different arms of the same thing. So instead of actually looking at each of our separate parts of the crisis, we need far more joined up thinking.
That's often been a problem. Anyway, thank you very much everybody for watching us today, and hopefully we'll be able to get those links up so that you can have a go to doing some self-sufficiency stuff yourself in the future. We'll have another go at it next week. Thank you.